The late afternoon sun bathed Miami International Airport in a warm golden glow, casting long shadows across the runways. Families reunited in tearful embraces, travelers rushed with rolling suitcases, and announcements echoed in multiple languages through the terminal. For most, it was just another busy day at one of America's largest airports. But for the 184 people preparing to board Atlantic Skyways Flight 829, this day would become a date engraved in history. The Boeing 757 stood at Gate C-17, its polished fuselage gleaming under the fading light. To the casual eye, everything seemed normal. Passengers queued for boarding, flight attendants greeted them with practiced smiles, and luggage was loaded into the belly of the plane. But among the hustle, there were subtle, almost imperceptible signs that this was no ordinary departure. Captain Robert Hughes, 49, a decorated Air Force veteran turned commercial pilot, walked toward the jet bridge with a measured stride. He had flown over 12,000 hours and was known for his calm under pressure. Yet today, the faintest crease marked his brow as he scanned the sky beyond the glass terminal walls. A storm system was forming far to the northeast, nothing the flight couldn't handle, but enough to catch his attention. Among the passengers was 32-year-old Claire Matthews, a schoolteacher from Portland, Oregon, traveling home after visiting her sister in Florida. She clutched her boarding pass in one hand and her grandmother's silver locket in the other. In seat 14A, she would have a clear view of the ocean during the first part of the journey, something she always loved. Claire had no way of knowing it might be the last sunset she would ever see from above the clouds. Also boarding was Daniel Ruiz, a software engineer from Austin, Texas, who had been in Miami for a tech conference. His laptop bag never left his side, and his eyes flickered with a mixture of excitement and worry. He had sent his wife a quick message before stepping onto the jet bridge. "Wheels up in 15, I'll call when I land, love you." That message would become the last she would ever receive from him. In the waiting area, 9-year-old Emily Carter pressed her face against the terminal window, watching ground crew bustle around the aircraft. Her mother, Jessica, smiled as she tried to keep her daughter entertained, unaware that these would be the final moments they would share in the comfort of the living. As boarding completed, an announcement crackled over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Atlantic Skyways Flight 829, non-stop service from Miami to New York's LaGuardia Airport. Our estimated flight time is 2 hours and 40 minutes. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for departure." Inside the cabin, the air was filled with the familiar hum of air conditioning and the rustle of seatbelts clicking into place. A faint scent of coffee drifted from the galley. Yet beneath this normalcy, there was an unshakable tension, a collective unease that no one could quite name. Captain Hughes's voice came over the intercom, steady but oddly distant. "Good evening, folks. We'll be taking off shortly. Weather looks clear for most of the route, though we may encounter some mild turbulence along the way. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The plane taxied to the runway, its engines rising to a powerful roar. As Flight 829 lifted into the sky, the city lights of Miami shimmered below, gradually fading into the deepening blue of the Atlantic evening. Passengers settled into their routines, some reading, some napping, some staring out into the vast ocean beneath them. But in the cockpit, Captain Hughes glanced at his first officer, Mark Dalton, after receiving an unusual update from air traffic control. A faint, intermittent radar return approximately 70 nautical miles ahead, moving erratically. It was probably nothing, just a weather anomaly, a glitch in the system. Still, Hughes made a mental note to keep an eye on it. None of them could have known that in less than an hour, Flight 829 would vanish from radar screens without a single distress call, plunging its crew, passengers, and the world into one of the most haunting aviation mysteries in American history. 38 minutes into the flight, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a fading orange glow in the west. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a dark and restless expanse. Inside the Boeing 757, the cabin lights were dimmed, casting a warm amber hue over the rows of passengers. It should have been a peaceful stretch of sky, but something felt wrong. Captain Hughes had been monitoring the faint radar anomaly since takeoff. It appeared briefly, then vanished, only to reappear further ahead, as if pacing the aircraft from a distance. It was impossible to identify, too erratic for another plane, too fast for weather patterns. He exchanged a glance with First Officer Dalton, who adjusted the range on the display and frowned. "Could be a weather cell breaking up," Dalton offered, though his voice carried little conviction. "Or a faulty transponder from a small aircraft," Hughes replied, but his hand lingered on the yoke longer than necessary. At 7:19 p.m., they received a call from Miami Center. 8:29, be advised, we're picking up some irregular readings ahead of you. Recommend a slight deviation, 2 degrees east. Copy that, Miami. 2 degrees east, Hughes responded, masking his unease. In the cabin, the seatbelt sign chimed on. The flight attendants moved quickly down the aisles, checking buckles and securing loose items. Claire Matthews, in 14A, noticed the subtle shift in the crew's demeanor. The smiles were there, but they no longer reached their eyes. She glanced at the ocean far below, black and bottomless, and felt a strange tightness in her chest. Emily Carter leaned against her mother, clutching her stuffed penguin. "Mommy, is the plane shaking?" Jessica smiled softly. "Just a little bump, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." But when Emily looked up, she caught her mother's eyes flick toward the overhead bins, as if calculating how much might fall if things got worse. Daniel Ruiz tapped out a quick message on his phone, just a short, "hitting some turbulence, talk soon," before tucking it into the seat pocket. He didn't know why, but a small voice inside urged him to send it just in case. Then the first jolt hit. Not the gentle rocking of normal turbulence, but a sharp, vertical drop that sent coffee spilling from cups and caused several passengers to gasp. Overhead bins rattled, and the cabin seemed to sigh as everyone braced themselves. In the cockpit, Hughes adjusted the throttles, trying to steady the plane. "That's not turbulence," he muttered. Dalton checked the weather radar. Still no signs of storms in their path, yet the anomaly was closer now, almost directly ahead. Another drop, steeper this time. Gasps turned into murmurs, and murmurs into whispered prayers. The aircraft felt as if it were descending into something unseen, something heavy. At 7:26 p.m., Miami Center called again, their tone noticeably sharper. 8:29, your transponder is showing altitude fluctuations we're not seeing on secondary radar. Confirm your current altitude, Hughes replied calmly, but his eyes betrayed concern. We're steady at 32,000. A pause. Roger that, 8:29, but secondary shows you at 31,400 and dropping. Dalton stared at the altimeter. It was dropping, slowly but undeniably. Yet their instruments insisted the plane was level. Something didn't match. In the cabin, passengers began to feel the subtle pressure changes. Ears popped. The air grew colder. Claire Matthews reached for the locket at her neck, her knuckles white. Emily whispered, "Mommy, it feels like we're falling." Jessica didn't answer. She couldn't. Then, for the briefest second, the cabin lights flickered. And when they steadied again, several passengers swore they saw something outside the windows. Pale lights, like lanterns, drifting just beyond the wingtips. By 7:32 p.m., the flight was no longer alone over the Atlantic. At least, not in the way they understood. 7:33 p.m. The Boeing 757 surged forward through the night sky, its engines humming with steady, obedient power. Yet, for those inside Flight 829, normality had begun to unravel. The pale lights spotted earlier were no longer fleeting. They now seemed to move in deliberate arcs, as if circling the aircraft at a measured distance. In the cockpit, Captain Hughes leaned forward, eyes narrowing on the black expanse ahead. The lights weren't on any radar return. No blips, no transponders, no signatures of another aircraft. They were simply there, visible to the human eye, but invisible to every instrument on board. Could be reflection off the cloud tops, Dalton offered weakly, but Hughes shook his head. No clouds here, and reflections don't change formation like that. At 7:35 p.m., Hughes keyed the mic. Miami Center, 8:29. Are you painting any traffic near our position? A long pause crackled back through the headset. Negative, 8:29. You're the only aircraft in your sector. Repeat, you are alone. The captain's gaze flickered to the altimeter again. It still read 32,000 feet. Dalton tapped the instrument lightly. An old pilot's reflex when a gauge didn't match reality, but the needle didn't move. In row 14, Claire Matthews pressed her face to the window. She could see the lights clearly now, 3 of them on the starboard side, pale as moonlight, gliding smoothly against the darkness. Their movement was unnatural, no flicker, no sway, no vibration from turbulence. It was as though they weren't bound by the same air currents the plane fought against. A man across the aisle muttered, "That's not another plane." His voice trembled, and no one contradicted him. The seatbelt sign dinged on again, followed by the calm but strained voice of a flight attendant. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing a temporary navigation issue." Emily Carter tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, those lights are following us." Jessica swallowed hard. She wanted to tell her daughter they were just stars. She wanted to believe it herself. But when she glanced out, she saw them too, and they were closer. At 7:38 p.m., a deep shudder ran through the fuselage. The cabin lights dimmed for 3 long seconds, then snapped back. Several passengers screamed. A baby began wailing in the back. Daniel Ruiz reached for his phone again, but the no-service indicator glared up at him. Back in the cockpit, Hughes tried the radio once more. "Miami Center, this is 829. We're experiencing unidentified visual contact, requesting possible course diversion." Silence. "Miami Center, confirm you copy." More silence, then static, loud and jagged, filling their headsets. Dalton tried VHF secondary, then HF long range. Nothing. Even the emergency frequency was drowned in the same oppressive hiss. By 7:40 p.m., the lights had moved closer still, too close. Claire could see their shape now, though describing it would be impossible later. They weren't solid, not in the way a plane or ship was solid. They seemed made of light itself, shifting in brightness, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The cabin had gone quiet, no conversations, no nervous laughter, just breathing, heavy, uneven breathing. Everyone knew something was happening that no airline safety card could prepare them for. Then, without warning, every light in the cabin went out. The hum of the engines faded into silence. For a moment, the passengers of Flight 829 were suspended in total darkness over the Atlantic, except for the 3 pale lights outside, now glowing brighter than ever. 7:41 p.m. The darkness inside Flight 829 was absolute, broken only by the faint, otherworldly glow of the 3 lights pacing alongside the aircraft. Passengers sat frozen, breaths shallow, waiting for the reassuring chime of systems returning, for the voice of a calm pilot explaining a harmless glitch. But the cabin remained still, save for the muffled sobs of a few who no longer cared to hide their fear. In the cockpit, Captain Hughes' training took over. "We've lost both generators," switching to APU. His hands moved with precision, flipping guarded switches, pressing emergency restarts. Nothing. The displays remained black. The familiar engine rumble was gone, replaced by the eerie whine of wind streaming past the fuselage. "Hydraulics are sluggish," Dalton reported, pulling back gently on the yoke. The controls resisted, as though the air itself had thickened. They were flying blind. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Atlantic Skyways 829. Loss of power, loss of comms, unknown visual contact." Static swallowed the rest. The radio might as well have been unplugged from the world. In the cabin, Claire Matthews gripped the armrest so tightly her knuckles ached. She could feel the subtle drop in altitude now, her stomach shifting with each descent. Somewhere behind her, a man began reciting the Lord's Prayer in Spanish, his voice quivering. Jessica Carter clutched Emily to her chest. "Close your eyes, baby. Just close your eyes." But Emily kept them open, staring out the window at the lights. "They're closer, Mommy. They're right there." Daniel Ruiz stood halfway, ignoring the seatbelt sign, and moved toward the rear galley where a flight attendant, her face pale in the dim glow of emergency strips, was rifling through a panel. "What's happening?" he demanded. She looked up at him, eyes wide, but her mouth formed no answer. Then, without warning, the lights outside changed. No longer drifting beside the plane, they darted ahead, positioning themselves directly in its path. The glow intensified, bleeding through the windows until the cabin seemed underwater in pale fire. The Boeing shuddered violently. Loose objects floated for a fraction of a second before slamming back down. The emergency floor lights flickered erratically, the green path to the exits interrupted by patches of darkness. Hughes fought the controls. "They're pulling us off course," he muttered, though later he wouldn't be able to explain what he meant, only that the sensation was undeniable. The aircraft was no longer fully under their command. Dalton's voice cracked. "We're down to batteries only. We've got maybe 10 minutes of emergency power." In row 14, Claire turned her gaze from the window and saw something she would remember for the rest of her life. Every passenger looking at one another, silently acknowledging the unspoken truth. They might not land anywhere tonight. The lights ahead pulsed once, twice, and then spread apart, revealing a wall of cloud unlike anything Hughes had ever seen. Not a storm, not mist. Something denser, darker, absorbing the starlight around it. At 7:45 p.m., Flight 829 entered the cloud. The world outside the windows vanished. The only sound was the collective heartbeat of 184 souls, pounding in a darkness that felt like it would never end. 7:46 p.m. The moment Flight 829 breached the wall of cloud, the cabin was swallowed by a darkness so deep it seemed to press against the windows. It wasn't like flying through a thunderstorm. There was no flicker of lightning, no faint glow of moonlight seeping through breaks in the vapor. This was total absence, as if the plane had been sealed inside a lightless chamber, suspended in mid-air. Inside the cockpit, Captain Hughes scanned what few instruments still glowed on the failing emergency power. The altimeter spun erratically, 31,000 feet, then 29,800, then back again in seconds. The artificial horizon twitched, unable to decide which way was level. Compass heading shifted wildly, rotating like a clock gone mad. "Gyros are useless," Dalton muttered, flicking a switch to standby systems. Nothing responded. "We're dead stick, Bob." Hughes' hands tightened on the yoke. "We're not dead stick yet," but both men knew it was a matter of minutes. Then came the sound, low, resonant, impossible to locate. It wasn't the whine of engines nor the rush of wind. It was a deep vibration that seemed to come from inside the bones, like standing too close to a cathedral organ. Every loose panel, every rivet in the fuselage hummed in sympathy. In the cabin, passengers felt it too. Claire Matthews's teeth rattled as she pressed the locket to her lips. Jessica Carter covered Emily's ears, but the girl looked past her, toward the window, whispering, "They're here." Daniel Ruiz tried to peer outside, but the darkness was so complete it was like staring into a void. Then, just for a second, he thought he saw movement. Shapes, darker than the dark, gliding alongside the fuselage. So close he could almost touch them if the glass weren't there. At 7:48 p.m., the lights returned. Not the soft, pale ones from before, but sharp, blinding streaks that cut through the blackness from every direction. They danced across the windows, illuminating terrified faces, then vanished as quickly as they came. The intercom clicked on, Hughes's voice strained but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a severe navigation malfunction. Please remain seated and keep your belts fastened." It was the last announcement the passengers would hear. One by one, the remaining cabin lights went out. The emergency strips along the floor flickered and died. Only the occasional ghostly flash outside offered any sense of space, and even those were gone within moments. The Boeing began to yaw gently left, then right, as if caught in invisible currents. Hughes tried to correct, but the controls felt wrong. Not stiff, not loose, wrong, like something else was subtly guiding them. Dalton's voice dropped to a whisper. "Bob, we're not in controlled airspace anymore." In row 14, Claire felt a sudden warmth in her chest, a contrast so sharp against the freezing air that it made her gasp. She looked around and saw others reacting too, some clutching their arms, others craning toward the windows with wide, unblinking eyes. Then at exactly 7:50 p.m., every instrument in the cockpit froze. Altitude, 30,137 feet. Airspeed, 0 knots. Heading, null. Flight 829 was still moving, but according to its own instruments, it no longer existed. 7:51 p.m. The moment the instruments froze, Captain Hughes felt a cold sweat break along his spine. Training had prepared him for electrical failures, navigation outages, even total engine loss, but never for the impossible. A plane in motion that registered as still, existing in a place its own systems could not find. Dalton tried a manual restart sequence, his hands moving on instinct. "Batteries gone. Bob, we're on nothing." Hughes gripped the yoke tighter. "Then we're going to hand-fly it down." But when he pulled back, nothing happened. The controls responded as if submerged in thick oil, moving just enough to mock the idea of control. The Boeing banked gently to the right. No input from the pilots. Hughes corrected left. The aircraft didn't obey. In the cabin, the shift was felt immediately. Loose items rolled across the floor. Passengers swayed in their seats. A suitcase broke free from an overhead bin, crashing into the aisle with a thud that made several people scream. Claire Matthews felt her stomach lurch, not from a drop, but from a slow, steady turn into nothingness. She looked to her left. The void outside pressed against the windows like black glass. She looked right. Faces stared back at her in the dimness, every expression carved in fear. Then Emily Carter's voice cut through the tense silence. "Mommy, someone's outside." Jessica turned sharply toward the window and froze. There was a shape there. Vague, shifting, almost human in outline, but too tall, too thin, its edges shimmering like heat haze. It moved alongside the aircraft with effortless precision, keeping pace at what should have been 500 miles per hour. Jessica's breath caught. She pulled Emily into her lap, but the girl was still staring at the window, wide-eyed. "They're waving," she whispered. At 7:53 p.m., the intercom crackled violently, a burst of static making passengers flinch. Then a sound emerged, low, rhythmic, almost like a voice speaking in a language none could recognize. The words, if they were words, resonated deep in the chest rather than the ear. Dalton's hands hovered over the radio panel. "That's not ATC." Hughes said nothing. He couldn't. The vibration began again, low at first, then building. The fuselage trembled, overhead panels rattling, emergency oxygen masks swaying on their tethers. Passengers gripped armrests, prayed aloud, called out names of loved ones as though speaking them could anchor them to the world they were leaving behind. Daniel Ruiz stood, shouting toward the cockpit door. "What's happening?" A flight attendant pushed him back into his seat, her own face pale with terror. "Please, sir, just please sit down." Outside, the dark shapes multiplied. First 2, then 5, then more, flitting in and out of sight, some moving above the wings, others below the fuselage. They moved with purpose, their motions synchronized like a silent choreography. At 7:56 p.m., the plane lurched violently downward. Screams filled the cabin, bodies pressing into seatbelts as gravity tightened its grip. Hughes pulled hard on the yoke, but it was like wrestling with a dream. Nothing responded. The shapes outside followed effortlessly. In the final seconds before the Boeing leveled out, every passenger felt it. A pull, deep and magnetic, as if the plane itself were being drawn somewhere it had no choice but to go. The air inside Flight 829 had changed. It was heavier now, harder to breathe. And somewhere beyond the windows, the darkness pulsed, like something alive. 7:57 p.m. The Boeing's nose leveled, but not because Captain Hughes had regained control. The yoke still felt heavy and disconnected, moving under his hands as if guided by unseen force. Every instinct screamed that they were no longer flying a course. They were being flown. Dalton scanned the dead screens, his own reflection staring back in the dark glass. "Bob, we're not in the system anymore. I can't get a single ping from GPS." Hughes didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the windshield, where the impenetrable blackness ahead had begun to change. Slowly, the darkness was giving way to a deep, impossible blue, glowing faintly from nowhere. It wasn't sky, it wasn't ocean. It was something in between, without horizon or ground. In the cabin, the passengers fell silent as the glow intensified. Claire Matthews leaned toward her window, pressing her forehead against the glass. Below them, shapes were forming, vast geometric patterns etched in lines of faint light that stretched in every direction. They looked like cities, but too precise, too symmetrical, like the blueprint of a place that could never exist on Earth. Emily Carter pointed with a trembling finger. "We're not over the water anymore." Her mother followed her gaze and felt her heart hammer against her ribs. There was land or something like it, but it was illuminated from within, glowing as though alive. At 7:59 p.m., a low hum filled the cabin again, stronger than before. The oxygen masks dropped without warning, swaying in front of pale faces. The flight attendants didn't even try to reassure anyone. They were too busy strapping themselves in, their hands shaking. Daniel Ruiz fumbled for his phone, desperate to record the impossible view outside. But when he raised it, the screen stayed black, no matter how many times he tapped it. Every electronic device in the cabin was dead. Then, for the first time, the shapes outside the plane came fully into view. They were no longer just shadows or silhouettes. They were structures, massive and moving. Their surfaces smooth and reflective, gliding silently alongside the aircraft. Some were the size of buildings, others impossibly larger, their edges fading into the blue glow. The Boeing banked gently left, without input from the cockpit. Hughes's hands remained on the yoke, but it was like holding the wheel of a ghost ship. Dalton's voice cracked. "They're taking us somewhere." At 8:01 p.m., the view outside changed again. The glowing patterns below stretched upward, forming towering arcs and columns that surrounded the plane like the walls of a colossal tunnel. The glow deepened, shifting toward violet, casting strange shadows across every face inside. The passengers clung to their armrests, each silently aware they were witnessing something no one else on Earth had seen, and that they might never return to tell it. When the Boeing passed fully into the tunnel of light, the windows went white. No shapes, no sky, no sea, just blinding brilliance. Then, all at once, there was nothing. No glow, no sound, no sense of motion at all. Flight 829 was gone. 8:02 p.m. Or at least that's what the cockpit clock still read. Captain Hughes glanced at it instinctively, but deep down, he knew the time was meaningless now. It could have been seconds since they entered the white void, or hours. His hands remained on the yoke, but there was no feedback, no vibration, no sound of air rushing past. It was as if the aircraft had been removed from flight entirely. Dalton's voice was a whisper, almost afraid of what might hear it. "We're stationary." Hughes shook his head slowly. "We can't be." But the truth pressed against his thoughts like cold iron. He felt it too. The sensation of movement was gone. No rise, no fall, no forward thrust. They were suspended, hanging in something that was not air. In the cabin, the silence was crushing. Without the roar of engines or the subtle tremor of flight, the passengers could hear every shallow breath, every creak of the fuselage. Some clung to the armrests with white-knuckled desperation. Others stared into the whiteness outside, as if willing it to resolve into a familiar world. Claire Matthews tried to focus on the texture of the locket in her palm, grounding herself in its familiarity. She whispered to herself, "It's just a plane ride. It's still just a plane ride." But her voice broke, betraying the lie. Jessica Carter stroked Emily's hair, her own heartbeat so loud she was sure her daughter could feel it. "We'll be okay, baby," she murmured, though she wasn't sure she even believed the words. Emily, strangely calm, looked up at her and said, "They're deciding what to do with us." At 8:04 p.m., the white void outside began to shift, slowly at first, then in great sweeping motions like ink swirling in milk. Colors emerged in thin ribbons, deep violets, silver blues, and a shade of gold that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the passengers' own heartbeats. Then came the distortion. Claire noticed it first in the seat ahead of her. The edges of the headrest seemed to ripple, bending slightly as if submerged underwater. Across the aisle, a man's watch slid upward along his wrist without being touched. The air inside the cabin grew heavier and warmer, pressing down on shoulders, making each breath an effort. Dalton tapped the altimeter, though it had been frozen for minutes. Without warning, the needle began to spin, rapidly, impossibly, cycling through altitudes faster than any climb or descent could allow. Hughes reached for the autopilot disconnect, then stopped. The button was gone. At 8:06 p.m., a deep tone resonated through the plane, not through the speakers but through the structure itself. Every surface vibrated with it, the seats, the windows, the very air. Passengers covered their ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside their bones. Then the whiteness outside fractured. Thin lines appeared, as though reality itself were cracking. Through those fractures, glimpses of impossible landscapes flickered, an ocean that curved upward into the sky, a city made of light suspended in nothing, stars arranged in spirals that moved like living things. Daniel Ruiz gripped the armrest, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes told him. "We're not anywhere," he said under his breath. And then, just as suddenly, the fractures sealed. The whiteness returned, and with it a new sensation, movement, smooth, silent but undeniable. The Boeing was being carried somewhere, whether its passengers wished it or not. No one knew if they were moving toward salvation or the end. 8:09 p.m. The sensation of movement grew stronger, a smooth acceleration that made no sound and no vibration. Captain Hughes could feel it pressing against his chest. But the airspeed indicator remained dead, frozen in place. Every pilot instinct in him screamed to fight it to regain control, but there was nothing to fight. Then, outside the cockpit windows, the whiteness began to thin. Shadows emerged within it, stretching and bending until they took on shapes, massive arching structures of a material that seemed neither metal nor stone. They glowed faintly from within, their surfaces rippling with light as though alive. Dalton's voice was tight. "What is this place?" Hughes didn't answer. He was too busy staring ahead, where the structures converged into what could only be described as a gate. Two colossal spires, rising into infinity, connected by a bridge of light. The Boeing was heading straight for it. In the cabin, passengers gasped as the view emerged through their windows. Claire Matthews pressed her forehead to the glass, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's beautiful," she whispered. And then, "God help us." Jessica Carter held Emily close. The girl's eyes were wide, but unafraid. "They're bringing us home," Emily said softly. Jessica wanted to correct her, to say we already have a home, but the words caught in her throat. Daniel Ruiz gripped his seat, forcing himself to keep looking. The structures were incomprehensibly large, each spire wide enough to hold a city, each detail too precise to be natural. Strange symbols shifted across their surfaces, rearranging themselves like living scripts. At 8:12 p.m., the lights outside the plane returned, dozens now arranged in symmetrical formation. They surrounded the Boeing in a perfect sphere, moving with mechanical precision. From the cockpit, Hughes could see them ahead and to the sides, each one pulsating faintly, matching the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Then, for the first time, something spoke. The voice did not come through the radio. It was inside their heads, soft, layered, and impossible to place as male or female. It spoke in a language none knew, yet somehow all understood. "You are between. You will not return the same." Dalton's hands trembled. "Bob, did you—" "I heard it," Hughes said, his own voice unsteady. "We all heard it." Gasps and murmurs swept through the cabin as every passenger realized they had shared the same message. Some began to cry openly. Others clutched their seats in stunned silence. The gate loomed larger, filling the windows until nothing else could be seen. The glow intensified, washing the cabin in pale gold. Passengers shielded their eyes, but the light seemed to pierce their eyelids, flooding their vision. At 8:15 p.m., the Boeing passed through. There was no turbulence, no jolt, just a sudden and absolute change. Outside, there was no sky, no ground, only a vast expanse of swirling color and drifting shapes that defied geometry. Time felt slower, each second stretching into eternity. And among the shapes, something moved, something vast, coiling and aware. 8:16 p.m. The swirling expanse outside was impossible to comprehend. It wasn't space, yet stars, if they were stars, floated in loose spirals, pulsing faintly before vanishing behind vast rivers of color. It wasn't ocean, yet shapes moved as if swimming through the currents. And it wasn't sky, though a dim light seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. But the most unsettling thing was the scale. From the cockpit, Captain Hughes could see it moving, first a shadow, then a form so massive it could only be compared to a mountain range drifting through the void. Its outline coiled and shifted, never still, its surface rippling like the skin of a deep-sea creature. The closer it came, the more impossible details emerged, vast patterns like circuitry or veins, glowing faintly with the same golden hue as the gate they had passed through. Dalton's breath was shallow. "Bob, it's looking at us." Hughes didn't need to ask how he knew. He felt it too, an immense, deliberate awareness pressing against his thoughts, probing without words. His hands tightened on the yoke, though it was long useless. In the cabin, the sensation struck all at once. Conversations died mid-sentence. Passengers straightened in their seats, eyes wide, as if bracing for an unseen impact. Claire Matthews felt it like a spotlight inside her chest, a presence sifting through her memories, her fears, her most private thoughts. She tried to look away from the window, but her gaze was drawn back, as if held by invisible hands. Jessica Carter clutched Emily close. The little girl stared toward the front of the plane, her lips moving in silence. Jessica bent down to hear her, but Emily's words chilled her to the bone. They're deciding who stays. Daniel Ruiz had the urge to stand, to shout, to do something, but the air itself seemed heavier now, pressing him into his seat. His vision blurred around the edges, colors warping, as if reality were being bent like glass under heat. At 8:18 p.m., the voice returned, not through ears, but directly in the mind. This time it was sharper, layered with a chorus of tones that made it feel like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You are seen. You are known." Some passengers whimpered. Others began to cry openly. A man in row 23 shouted in defiance, swearing at the unseen entity. He was still shouting when the world outside the windows shifted, and a shape, impossibly thin, yet unimaginably tall, moved closer to his side of the plane. For a moment, its face, or what might have been a face, pressed against the glass. No features, only shifting light where eyes might be, and an unblinking focus that made the man collapse back into his seat. Silent. The Boeing itself seemed to hum now, a deep resonance that matched the entity's presence. Panels in the overhead compartments vibrated, seat frames shivered, and somewhere in the walls of the fuselage, a faint rhythmic clicking began, like the ticking of a vast clock. Claire's breathing quickened. She could feel the presence sorting through her, lingering on the memory of her grandmother's funeral, the locket in her hand, the quiet prayers she hadn't spoken aloud in years. It wasn't random. It was searching. Dalton glanced at Hughes, his eyes glassy. "They're inside my head, Bob. They're showing me things." Hughes didn't respond. He was seeing them too, visions flashing behind his eyes, a shoreline under two suns, an endless forest of crystal towers, a night sky full of colors Earth's air had never allowed. And then the message came again, more forceful, more precise. Some will return, some will remain. At 8:21 p.m., the massive shape outside shifted. Portions of its glowing surface unfolded like petals, revealing countless smaller forms within, each moving with insect-like precision, darting between the currents of light. A few approached the Boeing, stopping just short of the wings. They were smooth, mirror-like, reflecting the terrified faces pressed against the cabin windows. Claire saw her own reflection, but it was wrong. Her eyes were darker, her expression calm in a way she did not feel. The reflection blinked when she didn't. Emily whispered something again, almost too softly to hear. Jessica leaned in. "They're going to choose." The presence loomed closer still, its shadow engulfing the entire plane. The golden glow from its veins flared once, then dimmed, as if in thought. And for the first time, everyone on Flight 829 understood the truth. They were not just lost. They were on trial. 8:22 p.m. The thing outside, the mind that felt like an ocean pressing into a teacup, pulled closer until its glow bled through the cockpit glass and seeped down the aisle like fog. The Boeing 757 trembled, not from turbulence, but from resonance. Every screw and rivet seemed to sing a faint metallic note. Captain Hughes clenched the useless yoke and tried to swallow. His throat was desert dry. The voice, no, the thought, returned, louder, focused. Some will return, some will remain. A whisper moved through the cabin like wind through reeds. People looked at one another as if the answer might be written on a stranger's face. A flight attendant near row 20, mascara smudged into grey crescents, pressed a hand to the bulkhead to steady herself. "Please, stay seated," she said, but the words were brittle. They broke as soon as they hit the air. Then the choosing began. It started with light. Thin filaments, delicate as spider silk and bright as molten gold, lanced through the windows without shattering them. They sought people, not seats, sliding past armrests, curling around shoulders, hovering above knees, turning as if sniffing for a scent. The first thread paused over an elderly woman with a crocheted shawl and trembled, then touched her chest. She gasped, not in pain, but recognition. Her head tipped back, eyes shining, and a sob of relief broke from her lips. "Louise," she said, as if greeting someone who had been dead a long time. Another thread found the businessman who had mocked the fear earlier, the one with cufflinks and a wedding band he kept twisting. It touched the back of his hand. He yelped, more offended than hurt, and shook it off like a strand of hair. The filament hovered, tilted in the air, as if thinking, and then drifted away. Around the cabin, people began to cry, pray, plead. Two strangers clutched each other like siblings. A teenage boy with acne held a stuffed turtle against his chest and whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry," to a woman not on the plane. The filaments threaded through them all, tasting, testing, gathering. Jessica Carter wrapped both arms around Emily, who sat rigid and still, gaze fixed forward. A filament drifted toward them. Jessica's heart slammed so hard it hurt. She angled her body to block it, as if she could shield her daughter from light itself. The filament paused anyway, hovering just over Emily's shoulder. The girl didn't flinch. "It knows my name," she whispered. "I can hear it." "Don't talk to it," Jessica hissed, panic sharpening her voice. "Emmy, look at me, look at me." Emily did, and her eyes were strange, calm in a way that made Jessica's skin crawl. "It asked me a question," Emily said. "It asked what we'd do if we could go back different." Daniel Ruiz watched 3 filaments approach, then veer. When stopped above his aisle neighbor, a young woman biting her lip so hard it bled. The thread hovered, quivered, and withdrew. It felt like a test he wasn't studying for. He forced himself to stand, voice cracking. "Hey, take me, I don't have kids. I can—" A flight attendant shoved him back down with surprising strength. "Sit," she said, a low maternal order that tolerated no argument. But her own eyes tracked a filament as it curved toward the galley and paused over a family photo slipped under a clear panel. 3 faces, a dog with a ridiculous bow tie. The filament brightened, then dimmed, and drifted on. In the cockpit, Dalton shivered. "It's not random," he murmured. "Feels like weight, like it's measuring something I can't see." His vision blurred and cleared in pulses. Memory flashed behind his eyes. His father's hospice bed, the day he lied in a logbook to cover a maintenance delay. The girl whose name he never learned who left a coffee on an exam morning. He flinched from the softness old griefs carried. "I don't want it to see me," he said, voice small. "It already does," Hughes answered. He thought of a boy on a beach with a kite, of a promise he'd made on a tarmac under July heat, "I will always bring them home," and how 1,000 landings had bent that vow into something like superstition. The vow felt louder now, as if the presence had picked it up and was weighing it like a coin. The voice threaded through again, a cord made of vowels the mouth could never shape. Return is not reward. Remaining is not punishment. Exchange preserves balance. "Balance?" Claire Matthews repeated to no one, pressing the locket to her sternum. "What balance? Between what?" A filament hovered above her and warmed, like sunshine on winter skin. She thought of the classroom she would return to, the kids who'd still be laughing into their sleeves, the girl who'd stopped eating when her mom left. She thought wildly, "They need me." The filament pulsed, once, twice, like a heartbeat that had just decided to keep going. Rose behind her, another filament dropped toward a man with a sleeve of tattoos and a shy smile. His breath stuttered. "No," he said, as someone might answer a proposal they didn't expect. Tears ran into the curve of his mouth. "I said I didn't want to die anymore," he told the air. "I said that." The voices in passengers' heads split and braided. Some heard songs, others heard static, still others heard words they couldn't translate, but somehow understood in bone marrow. Unfinished, anchored, fallow, calling. The plane was a hive, each cell lit by its own private visitation. Panic detonated in pockets. A man unbuckled and lunged down the aisle toward the back, as if distance could hide him. 3 filaments followed without haste, like curious fish. He swatted at them. His hand went through light that wasn't warm or cold. Just there. He screamed, a raw animal sound, and sat where he was, shaking. A woman in row 8 put her palms up, face tipped to the ceiling, and said very gently, "I'm ready," though no one had asked her aloud. The air thickened. Pressure pressed on eardrums. Tears sprang unbidden. The smell changed, too. Ozone and rain on hot asphalt, and a hospital corridor at 3 a.m. Emily lifted her hands as if feeling wind. "It's not a monster," she said. "It's a door." Jessica could barely breathe. "No, baby, I am the door. You go through me." Her voice broke on the last word. The filament above Emily lowered by a fraction. It felt like a hand hovering above a fevered brow. In the cockpit, Hughes unlatched the harness and stood, legs unsteady. Dalton grabbed his sleeve. "What are you doing?" "What I said I'd always do." Hughes stepped into the cabin. Faces turned toward him, relief greedy and desperate. He wasn't a fix. He was a father figure conjured by authority and a navy tie. He raised both hands. "Listen to me. We are not animals in a trap. We are people. Remember that." His eyes found the little girl. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "what did it ask you?" Emily studied him with the grave serenity of children who have seen too much. "If it sent us back, would we be different? If we'd remember enough to change things?" She looked at the window. at the thing beyond it. It says it's tired of taking and giving to the wrong places. Claire exhaled a laugh that tasted like salt. Same, she whispered. Hughes faced the aisle, lifted his chin toward the light. I'll make you a bargain, he said to something that did not need sound. Take me. Send them. The sentence surprised him by how right it felt in the mouth, like a truth you only recognize when you speak it. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then one filament dipped toward him and touched his temple. Cold fire flooded his skull. Not pain, but a memory so bright it obliterated the edges of time. A night approach through fog to a runway lit like a string of pearls. The tower's voice calm as fate, the heavy, holy thud of wheels kissing home. He could smell the jet fuel, the wet concrete, the rain in a woman's hair as she kissed him beside a baggage carousel. When the light withdrew, he was crying, stunned by a gratitude that felt borrowed. Choice is considered, the mind said with something like respect. Chaos surged. A man shouted, "You can't decide for us." A woman answered, "He's not, he's offering." The distinction mattered. It changed the temperature in the room by a single degree. More filaments dropped. Some landed and stayed, a tender weight that anchored without binding. Others touched and lifted away, as if saying, "Not yet." Jessica felt one brush the back of her hand. For an instant, she smelled summer grass and wet pennies and her mother's cheap perfume. It lifted. Relief collapsed her lungs, and guilt rushed in to take its place. Daniel waited for his judgment like a verdict in a courtroom. When the filament finally paused over him, he lifted his face to it and did something unexpected. He confessed, in a voice barely audible to the living, to the mind, and to himself, "I should have been there more. For her. For Theo. I hid behind work." The filament brightened, not approval, not condemnation, recognition. It touched the inside of his wrist, warmth pooled there and moved up his arm, like a vein being mapped by light. "Does that mean—" he started, but the words fell apart. The cabin's geometry seemed to flex. Angles softened. Distance felt unreliable. Somewhere toward the rear, a man fainted into his neighbor's lap. She stroked his hair the way one does for lovers and children and strangers on airplanes. A flight attendant clipped a portable oxygen bottle to his mask with shaking hands and whispered, "Stay, please stay," though she didn't know whether she was addressing him or herself. The presence gathered. The filaments braided into thicker cords that threaded through the cabin, looping gently around 12, then 20, then, God, 30 bodies. Each contact made a tiny sound no ear could hear, but every cell could. A click like a key turning in an old lock. Emily looked down the aisle and counted in a whisper only her mother heard. When she reached a number, she stopped. Her mouth opened and closed. Jessica gripped her hand hard enough to hurt. "Don't say it," she begged. "Please don't say it." Hughes waded through the cords of light, which parted for him like reeds in a river. He reached row 14 and dropped to a knee. Claire blinked at him. Hope, skepticism, a teacher mastering her face. "Can you fix this?" she asked. "Pure and impossible." He shook his head. "I can witness it." He reached up and touched the filament above her as one might test a campfire's heat. It neither burned nor recoiled. It thrummed. He thought of the vow again, "I will always bring them home," and knew that sometimes the work was not landing wheels on asphalt, but telling the story of the ones who did and did not return. The mind poured one last sentence through them all. It felt older than language, like rain learning to fall. Balance requires memory. The cords tightened, not choking, not dragging, simply claiming. People cried out, not in pain, but in the terror of leaving the familiar. 12 threads glowed brighter, then 20, then a number no one would be able to agree on later because time was a trickster in that place, and light could look like more than it was. Jessica's vision tunneled. A second filament lowered toward Emily's chest. Jessica lunged, arms out. "Take me, not her." The plea ripped a hole in her voice. The thread paused, listened, then rose a breath width. The first filament stayed where it was, a soft fingertip of light over Emily's heart. Hughes straightened, spine a steel rod forged of terror and love. "Listen to me," he said to the cabin, to the mind, to God. "If any of us returns, we carry all of us. That's the balance, that's the memory." Something in the light changed. It was subtle, but it spread, an exhale passing from filament to filament, a recognition that asked for no answer. The plane shifted, not forward, not down, toward. The gate, the bridges of light, the impossible arches beyond reality's shore, folded around them like the ribs of a cathedral. The presence swelled, pressure built behind eyes and ears, until tears leaked from people who did not cry. Chords brightened. The counting reached whatever number the balance required. "Hold on," Hughes whispered, though there was nothing to hold. He took one last look at the little girl with two filaments hovering, at the mother with claws in her palms from holding too hard, at the teacher whose locket glowed from within as if lit by Grandma's breath, at the man with code under his fingernails and an apology in his throat. The world flashed white, clean, blinding, absolute, and the choosing was made. 8:22 p.m. Or whatever time means when a clock has forgotten how to tick. Light swallowed them. Not a blast or a burn, but a clean absence, like snow falling inside a dream. Every voice became thought, every thought became a thread, and the threads braided into one bright rope that ran through the length of Flight 829. Then, with a soft thud that nobody heard and everybody felt, the world clicked back into place. Wind, sound, gravity returning like an old ache. The engines coughed alive mid-spool, the airframe juddered, and 1,000 vibrations, the small, reassuring noises of human-made flight, poured through the fuselage. Captain Hughes snapped forward into the cockpit as if a hand had released his chest. Dalton flinched and slapped at dead switches that were suddenly alive, Icas blinking, standby attitude righting itself, altitude tape sliding back from nonsense to numbers that meant something. "Ronter, this is Atlantic Skyways 829, radio check," Hughes barked, voice hoarse, heart punching his ribs. Static, then a voice so normal it made him dizzy. "Atlantic 829, Miami Center, radar contact. Thought we lost you there. Say again your request?" Dalton grabbed the yoke in disbelief. It had weight again. Air had returned to the world. Outside the windshield, the sky was black and honest, stippled with familiar stars. The ocean below reflected a broken moon. No arches, no gates, no living geometry. Just the Atlantic night breathing like a sleeping animal. Hughes looked down. Time. 8:23 p.m. His hand trembled. That wasn't right. They'd been gone longer, a minute, an hour, a lifetime. He didn't know. But the clock insisted on its lie. He forced the next thing. Checklists. APU as backup, cross-flow, hydraulics, fuel. "Bob," Dalton whispered. He was staring at the first officer's window, at the faintest ghost of a handprint on the outer pane. It wasn't grease. It was light. It faded as they watched, like breath on glass in winter, and was gone. In the cabin, the sound of people existing returned in layers, sobs, prayers, somebody laughing the laughter of someone who caught a falling knife by the blade and cannot believe they still have fingers. The oxygen masks dangled like wilted lilies. The emergency strips glowed steady green again. Somewhere in the back, a phone rebooted itself and sang the little tune that meant everything was normal, and nothing was. Then the roll call began. A flight attendant with wild hair and a voice made of gauze walked the aisle, counting out loud because numbers rooted her to a floor that had recently forgotten to be a floor. 17, 18, please sir, eyes up. 19. She reached 27 and stopped. Her mouth opened, closed. She started again, forcing the cadence to carry her. 28, 29. Jessica Carter held Emily's cheeks in her palms, scanning for the smallest wound, the softest bruise, anything she could fix, because there were so many things she could not. "Are you hurt? Emmy, look at me." "I'm okay," Emily said. She really was. She looked impossibly older for a girl whose knees were still scabbed from bicycles. "Mom," she added, almost apologetic. I said yes. Jessica's heart tripped. "To what?" "To remembering." Emily's gaze slid to the aisle. "So we can change the parts we're supposed to." Claire Matthews counted with the attendant. 32, 33. She held her locket so hard the chain cut a line in her neck. 34. She said the number before the attendant did, as if speaking them out loud could keep the world from subtracting. 35. The subtraction took its first bite. "Captain!" The interphone cracked. We're missing some." Hughes closed his eyes. He had known it since the click in the light. He had felt the brace of the cords around certain bodies. 12 or 20 or a number time could not keep still. He opened his eyes and looked at Dalton, whose lips had just formed a name he would never teach the investigators. Hughes keyed the mic to center, because that was the piece of the universe he could still control. "Miami Center, 8:29, declaring emergency. We've had a total systems anomaly. Request vectors direct to MIA for immediate landing and full medical response. Affirm, 8:29. Turn left heading 185. Descend and maintain 10,000. Say souls on board." He swallowed and stared down the night. "Stand by," he said, and his voice scraped. The second subtraction was quieter and crueler. A mother raised her head and realized the bag of snacks under the seat felt heavy with cans no one had taken. The man with a sleeve of tattoos looked down at a blank space between armrests, where a shy smile had been. A teenage boy held a stuffed turtle to a seat that had no body in it and whispered the apology, too late, for the person it needed to find. Claire stood. Her legs worked, her legs held. She had never loved gravity so much. She moved into the aisle to let a flight attendant through and brushed against light that wasn't there. It felt like leaving church before the last verse of the hymn. "Everyone," Hughes said on the PA, the words so careful they were almost holy. "We are under control and heading for Miami. Emergency crews will meet us. Please stay seated. Please hold on to one another if you need to." He paused. Something inside him turned once, like a key. "If anyone beside you is missing, press your call button. We will account for everyone." The lights came on brighter. The buttons bloomed orange and chimed in ragged chorus. The descent hurt. The air felt too thick, like it held a grudge. The plane creaked in that way aging planes do when their bones speak to the weather, and yet the altimeter made sense again, and the glide slope came alive like an old friend who refused to stop loving you even when you broke their heart. At 9,000 feet, Miami spilled across the black like a broken necklace of sodium. The shoreline stitched a line of white seam where the water licked sand. The world had the decency to look ordinary. On final, Hughes felt the absence in the fold of the harness strap across his chest. It was small and precise as a paper cut. He let himself think the thought he'd been dodging since the light. Some will remain. He didn't know if that meant with the presence, or inside the heads of those who had come back, or in a place words couldn't point to. He only knew that the number center wanted would not match the number of seatbelts buckled on departure. 500, Dalton called, voice steady again, as if steadiness could become a force of physics if enough men tried hard enough. Approach stabilized. Landing, Hughes said, and put them on the numbers like he'd done since the first time a chief pilot watched his hands through a clipboard's hole and decided to trust him with the lives of strangers. Tires kissed runway, spoilers snapped, reversers roared. The cabin let go of a breath nobody knew they'd been holding since the sky had gone wrong. Lights whipped past the windows. A child clapped once, out of some long-ago reflex learned on first flights. The clap broke into sobs. They turned off onto a taxiway, already lined with fire and rescue trucks, red lights revolving like constellations that cities make when they're worried about you. The tug that came to meet them felt like a hand on a shoulder. The chocks felt like an argument ending. When the door opened, the night air was damp and ordinary and smelled like jet fuel and cut grass. The first paramedic stepped on like a person walking into the second act of a play without a script. The flight attendants counted again, this time with clipboards, ink bleeding as if the numbers wanted to run. In the terminal, the news crawled faster than feet. Phones rang, then stopped ringing. Words like lost contact, re-established, anomaly ghosted across screens. A rumor rippled that the plane had been gone for hours. A rumor countered that it had diverted for weather none of the other flights had seen. An old man in a polyester blazer said, proudly, that he had seen lights over the water in the 70s, and they always come back. A woman in a yellow dress dropped to her knees when she saw a little girl with a braid she recognized, and said Emily as if it were a password. The debriefs began before the deplaning ended. Federal people in windbreakers. Airport people in high-vis vests, airline people whose smiles had been trained to do the impossible and were being asked to do it again. Passports collected, names recorded, dates of birth, next of kin. Did you see any smoke? Did you smell anything strange? Did you experience a loss of consciousness? Did you see lights? The voice recorder came out of the bay like a stone from a river that had learned how to sing. The download room was cold, brightly lit, full of paper cups half full of coffee, and the devotion of men who believe everything has a reason if you dig long enough. The audio revealed radio calls that existed only on one side and a long section of hiss that, when run through software designed to clean speech from mud, produced a note the technician had no vocabulary for. Not a tone, not a frequency, but the outline of a cathedral carved in sound. The radar data showed a blip that had flickered, faded, jumped, and returned in a place the math did not like. The flight plan had a scar where vectors should have gone. The weather radar on other planes showed clear skies exactly where Flight 829 had flown through something too present to be weather. The clocks on 3 watches, worn by 3 separate passengers, stopped at 7:50 and started again at 8:09 without being touched. In a makeshift family room behind a security door, someone passed tissues and someone else passed water, and the televisions were turned off because the people inside the story did not need to hear their story told by mouths that hadn't tasted its metal. A counselor with a gentle jawline said, "Grief and relief can live in the same body. It will feel like drowning in air." Heads nodded, sobs burst. Laughter cut sideways through the grief like sunlight through blinds. A mother asked, "Where is my son?" as if the question could alter physics. The airline representative, who had practiced sentences for hurricanes and engine failures and unaccompanied minors, found that those sentences were made of straw here. She said the only sentence that can live in this kind of room without lying, "We will not stop looking." Claire sat with a blanket she didn't need around her shoulders and a cup she didn't drink. She touched the locket and thought of an empty desk with a name card and a turtle sticker that would still be on it Monday. She thought of lesson plans that had been harmless in the morning and would be heavy now. She thought of the filament warming over her heart and of the mind saying that balance required memory. She understood that remembering would be her work now. Not a choice or a hobby, but a job with a paycheck paid in ache. Daniel answered questions he could answer, name, seat, what he saw, and the one he could not. Why him and not the woman who had been biting her lip so hard it bled? Later, when they let him go home, he drove with both hands at 10 and 2, and at a red light, called a number he should have called more and said, voice shaky, "I'm here, I'm not leaving again." On the other end, silence turned to breath, turned to crying, turned to a beginning. Hughes stood in a small room with grey carpet, white walls, 2 badges he didn't read, and a recorder on the table that blinked a red dot like a steady heart. "Captain, can you walk us through the event from the moment of the first anomaly?" the man asked. His pen hovered as if afraid of its own ink. Hughes looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had never crashed, who had flown widows and newborns and CEOs and a brass band once when weather stranded them. He cleared his throat. "Yes," he said. He told them everything he could without saying the pieces human mouths haven't learned how to carry. He did not mention the bargain. He did not say the word remain. He did not say door. When they asked him to state souls on board at landing, he spoke the number as it appeared on the manifest, and then he spoke the sentence that would stitch him into the story forever. We came back incomplete. He slept that night for 2 hours and woke with the taste of rain on his tongue and the memory of light sliding through his skull. Not painful, only holy. He put both feet on the floor and for a moment was a boy with a kite again. In the days that followed, the world did what it always does, surrounded the whole with words. Talk shows chewed it. Websites lit it with neon theories. A famous author tweeted a thread about ancient gates. A physicist shook his head on cable news and said the instruments were wrong, and someone else shook her head in the same square of screen and said, instruments are only as right as reality lets them be. The airline called it a navigation incident. Blogs called it the night of the halo. People who had seen lights in other decades wrote emails that began with, "You don't know me," but the official report would take years and say as much as such reports can say without stepping into poetry. It would list times and headings and failures and restorations and crew resource management exemplary and passenger accounts inconsistent and no evidence of weather in sector. It would not use the word choice. It would not say the number of watches that stopped. And still, in kitchens and classrooms and cabs and empty seats next to turtles, people would do the only experiment life lets you repeat. Wake up again and see if memory has learned how to be muscle. Claire would put her hand on one empty desk and tell a story about courage that did not lie about terror. Jessica would let Emily stand at the end of the driveway with a telescope and stay up late beside her until both of them learned which stars were stars and which were airplanes and which were the kind of lights you keep to yourself because they are not proof. They are a promise. Daniel would become the sort of man who picks up when it is inconvenient. Hughes would fly again, his hands steady on the yoke, and every time he checked the altimeter, he would feel a filament's warmth and think, balance requires memory. He would make his landings like prayers, controlled, precise, full of gratitude and a little bit of awe. On the first Sunday after, families gathered on a beach where the runway lights become fireflies. They brought candles that the wind tried to steal, and they cupped the candles with both hands, and they said names. A child drew a gate in the sand with a stick, and waves erased it because that is the sea's job. Someone sang off key, and it was beautiful. Nobody agreed how many minutes Flight 829 was gone. Nobody agreed what the lights were. Nobody agreed about the voice. But when people looked one another in the eye, they agreed about this. Whatever took them did not take without giving, and whatever gave them back did not give without asking something in return. That night, after the lights and the songs and the paper cups of coffee, Emily stood in the doorway and said, "Mom." Jessica turned, already braced. "What is it, baby?" "If we forget," Emily said, matter of fact, the way children deliver instruments of prophecy, "we might have to go again." Jessica crossed the room and went to her knees and put her forehead against her daughter's, as if the two skulls could become a bowl that held what must not spill. "Then we won't," she said. "We won't forget." Outside, a plane lifted through ordinary air into an ordinary sky and banked toward a future that would be measured in small, brave promises kept.